It began with the smell of rain coming, a metallic tang in the air that did nothing to cleanse the scent of burned cedar and grief. Amos, 12 years old with bones that seemed too long for his skin, stood perfectly still in the ashes of the old tool shed. In his hand, he clutched a single, blackened hinge, its metal still warm. Around him, the muted sounds of Green Hill Plantation carried on, the distant chop of an axe, a mule's bray, the call of a field hand from the far end of the cotton row. But here, in this small circle of ruin, the world was silent. Master Linus's voice, when it came, was not the whip-crack Amos expected. It was quiet, a low, measured sound like stone grinding against stone. "Look at me, boy." Amos lifted his head. Linus Davenport stood a few feet away, a man of 50 with a face that seemed carved from the same pale Georgia granite as the hearth in the great house. His broadcloth coat was unbuttoned, his boots dusty. He did not look at the ashes. He looked only at Amos, his eyes the color of a winter sky. "My grandfather's tools were in that shed," Linus said. "Adzes and Frost brought from Virginia. 100 years of careful keeping. Gone." Amos said nothing. His throat was sealed shut with the same ash that coated his tongue. "The overseer says it was a lamp. Knocked over. In a shed no one had cause to enter after sundown." Linus took a single step forward. The sweet, cloying scent of his pipe tobacco cut through the char. "You are a strange child, Amos. Quiet. You watch things. You have a habit of being where things happen. Where things break." A drop of rain hit the hinge in Amos's hand, sizzling softly. He had not knocked over a lamp. He had been in the loft of the main barn, watching the stars through a crack in the shingles, a secret pastime. He had seen the first flicker in the shed window, had slid down the ladder and run, but it was a full blaze by then, hungry and roaring. He had stood and watched it, as he watched everything, and in that watching, he had seen a shadow detach itself from the corner of the great house and slip into the night woods. He had not seen a face. Only a shape, moving with a swift, sure purpose. "You will not work the fields today," Linus decreed. "You will stay here. You will sift every handful of these ashes. You will lay out every nail, every scrap of iron you find. You will not eat, you will not drink, you will not move from this spot until it is done. And you will think on the nature of loss." Linus turned and walked back toward the white-pillared house, its grandeur serene and untouchable on the rise. The overseer, a gaunt man named Pritchard with a neck like a twisted rope, spat a stream of brown tobacco juice near Amos's feet. "You heard him. Get to sifting, ash boy." The rain began in earnest then, a slow, cold drizzle that turned the ash to a gray paste. Amos knelt. His knees sank into the muck. He started to sift. And as his fingers closed around the first nail, bent and useless, his mind did not travel to the lost tools of a dead grandfather. It traveled back, as it always did when the world pressed in too close, to the beginning. To the story of his own making, told in whispers by a fire that had not been meant for warmth, but for survival. He was born Amos in the summer of 1832, in the dirt-floored cabin of the new quarter at Green Hill. His mother was Leah, a woman who worked the loom house, whose hands could make stubborn thread sing into cloth. His father was a man named Isaac, a carpenter hired from a neighboring plantation for a season, who was sold to Mississippi before Amos ever drew breath. He knew Isaac only as a deep, warm laugh Leah would sometimes mimic when she held him close in the dark, a sound that seemed to make her both smile and weep. His first memory was not a sight, but a sensation, the rhythmic thump-thump-thump of the loom's pedals beneath the cabin floor, a heartbeat transmitted through the earth. His second memory was sound, the cry of a newborn, his sister, small and red and squalling. Leah named her Hope. "A name is a prayer," she told Amos, who was then 3, his wide eyes taking in the tiny, furious creature. "You pray with it every day." His world was a small triangle, the cabin, the loom house, and the strip of yard between, where chickens scratched and old Aunt May told stories of tortoises and hares under the sprawling chinaberry tree. But the boundaries of that world were marked by absences. The empty space where old Ben used to sit, whittling, before he was sold south. The sudden silence from the cabin 2 doors down when the Wilson family was broken apart, the children sent to different farms, the mother left to stare at the wall. Leah would hold Amos and Hope tighter on those nights, her breathing shallow with a fear she could not name aloud. Amos learned the rules early. Keep your eyes down when a white person passes. Speak only when spoken to. Do not look too long at the great house, or at the horses, or at the books Master Linus sometimes read on the veranda. Work was the constant. As soon as he could walk steadily, he was given tasks, fetching water, scaring birds from the garden, carrying the smaller tools for the carpenters. His hands were always busy, but his mind was free to wander. He developed a watchfulness, a profound stillness. He saw how a cloud's shadow could make the overseer, Pritchard, check the time. He noticed which mule would balk at a certain patch of ground, which hen laid her egg in the nettles instead of the coop. He collected facts the way other children might collect smooth stones. His uniqueness was not in strength or song. It was in his silence, and in what he did with it. He became a listener of worlds. He could stand for an hour, a bucket in his hand, and hear the difference between the wind in the oaks and the wind in the pines. He could tell, by the pitch of the bullfrogs in the creek, if rain was truly coming. He learned the language of the barn, the soft nicker of a contented horse, the anxious stamp of one with a stone in its shoe, the particular creak of the loft door that meant someone was coming up the ladder. He heard the whispered conversations of the adults after dusk, the names of places, Ohio, Canada, Philadelphia, spoken like fragments of a holy verse. When he was 6, he discovered a different kind of language. In the master's stable, helping to brush down the carriage horses, he saw young Master James, Linus's 15-year-old son, tracing letters in the dust on a harness with his finger. A, B, C, Amos watched, unmoving, as the shapes appeared and disappeared. Later, with a stick in the dirt behind his cabin, he tried to replicate them. The curves and lines were magic. They held meaning. He showed Leah. Her face, usually a mask of gentle endurance, went pale. She scuffed out the shapes with her bare foot. "That is forbidden, child," she hissed, her voice low and urgent. "That is a road that leads only to the whipping post, or worse. You put that seeing eye away. You hear me? Some things are too heavy for us to carry." But he couldn't unsee them. The letters lived in his mind. He began to see them everywhere, in the branching of a tree, Y, in the hoop of a barrel, O, in the angle of a roof, A. It was a secret knowledge, a tiny, quiet fire he carried inside. He learned more by stealth, watching James's lessons through the schoolroom window from a distance, studying discarded scraps of newsprint that had been used to wrap a parcel. He never spoke of it. It became his first, and greatest, secret. His daily labor grew with his body. By 8, he was in the fields during planting and harvest, a helper moving along the rows behind the adults. The cruelty of the system was not always in the lash, though that was present, a crack in the air that made everyone flinch. It was in the relentless, grinding weight of it. The sun that did not care if you were thirsty. The cotton bowl whose sharp points shredded your fingertips until they bled. The overseer's tally book, where your name was a number next to a weight, and falling short meant a deduction from the meager weekly rations of cornmeal and fatback. It was in the quiet dominion of Linus Davenport. The master was not a raving brute. He was a businessman, a descendant of proud Carolina stock who had carved Green Hill from the wilderness. He believed in order, in discipline, in the natural hierarchy of things. His cruelty was administrative, dispassionate. He would stand at the edge of a field, calculating. He would order a pregnant woman back to work 2 days after childbirth because the weather was fair and the crop was waiting. He would separate a mother from her child to work in the house, not out of malice, but because the child was distracting. He presided over the quarterly settlements, where accounts were settled and punishments met, with the calm demeanor of a banker reviewing ledgers. The worst punishment Amos ever saw him administer directly was not a whipping, but a sentence. A man named Elijah, caught trying to learn to read, was not beaten. Instead, Linus sold Elijah's wife and infant son to a trader from Alabama. "You have confused your mind with thoughts unfit for your station," Linus told the shattered men. "I am relieving you of the distractions. Elijah walked into the river 3 nights later and did not walk out. It was after this that Amos's silence deepened, hardened into something like armor. He spoke less. He observed more. He tended his secret knowledge of letters like a hidden garden. Then, when he was 10, the central pillar of his world crumbled. A fever swept through the quarters. It took the old and the very young. Hope, his bright, chattering 7-year-old sister, burned with it for 3 days. Leah fought, using every herb and prayer she knew. On the 4th day, as a cold dawn broke, Hope's breathing, which had been a ragged struggle, simply stopped. The silence in the cabin was absolute and terrible. Leah did not cry. She closed Hope's eyes, washed her small body, and wrapped her in a clean sheet. She then walked to the great house and stood on the back porch until Linus came out. "My daughter has passed, Master." Linus nodded, barely looking up from the letter in his hand. "See the groundskeeper. He'll tell you where to dig." "I would like to mark her resting place," Leah said, her voice hollow but steady. "A piece of wood with her name." Linus finally looked at her. "That is a sentimental waste of labor and material. The field is for the living, not the dead. Bury her before the sun is high. You will be at the loom by noon." Leah returned to the cabin. She looked at Amos, who had heard everything from the doorway. Her eyes were dry, but in their depths, Amos saw something extinguish. She took his hand, and with her other, she picked up the small bundle that was Hope. They buried her in the slave graveyard, a weed-choked plot at the edge of the woods, in an unmarked grave. As they piled the dirt, Leah leaned close to Amos's ear. "Remember this place," she whispered, her breath hot with a new, fierce emotion. "Remember the smell of this dirt. Remember the shape of that tree. You carve her name in your heart, Amos. You be her marker." That night, with a stolen nail from the blacksmith's shed, Amos did just that. In the softwood underneath his sleeping pallet, where no one would ever see, he carefully scratched 5 letters, H-O-P-E. It was an act of defiance, of love, of memory. It was the first thing he ever wrote. A year after Hope's death, Leah was different. The lively light in her eyes, already dimmed, was gone. She worked the loom like an automaton, her movements precise but joyless. She began to whisper to Amos not just of Canada, but of more immediate things. She spoke of the swamp to the west, the trackless Okefenokee. She mentioned names, Moses, Harriet, people who were said to be guides. Amos listened, his watchfulness now tinged with a new, cold dread. He knew his mother was planning to run. He tried to lock her in with his silence, with his need. He clung to her at night. He brought her wildflowers. He excelled at his tasks, hoping to make their life seem more secure, more bearable. But the fire in Leah had banked, and was now turning toward a different kind of fuel, a desperate, reckless freedom. The plan, as much as he could piece together from her hushed words, involved a contact, a free black fisherman who came up the river every other week to sell his catch. A signal, a hidden place in the hold of his boat. A journey downriver to the coast, and then, uncertainty. The night before the fisherman was due, Leah held Amos's face in her hands. They were alone in the cabin. "My quiet watcher," she said, her voice trembling. "I must go. This place is burying me alive. But I will come back for you. I swear it on Hope's soul. I will find a way, and I will come back, and we will be free together." Amos wanted to scream, to beg, to tie himself to her. But his lifetime of silence held him fast. He only nodded, a hard, painful knot in his throat. She never made it to the fisherman. Pritchard, whose cruelty was less quiet than his master's, had noticed the change in Leah. He had seen the way her eyes followed the river road. He had his own network of informants, built on promises of extra rations or threats of punishment. Someone, perhaps jealous, perhaps just broken, told him of Leah's questions about the swamp. They came for her at dawn, as she slipped from the cabin. Pritchard and 2 field hands who owed him favors. Amos watched from the window, his fist crammed in his mouth. There was no struggle. Leah saw them, and her shoulders slumped. She looked once, directly at the window where Amos hid in shadow, and then let them lead her away. She was not publicly whipped. Linus Davenport did not believe in spectacles that might inspire unrest. Instead, she was taken to the smokehouse, a small, windowless brick building used for storage and private correction. She was kept there for 3 days. Amos, frantic, hung around the yard, using his stillness to become invisible. He heard the snippets, that she was being questioned, that she would be made an example of, that Master was considering selling her to the New Orleans market, where her skill with textiles would fetch a good price but her spirit would be crushed in the city's grinding mills. On the evening of the 3rd day, as the sky turned the color of a bruise, the tool shed caught fire. And Amos, sifting through the cold, ashy paste in the rain, holding the blackened hinge, knew 2 things with a certainty that chilled him deeper than the weather. His mother had not knocked over a lamp. And the shadow he had seen fleeing was not a figment of his terror. Pritchard had done it. He had set the fire. But why? To destroy evidence? To create a distraction? Or was it a message, a demonstration of power so complete it could conjure disaster from thin air? Amos sifted until his fingers were raw and numb. He laid out a pathetic mosaic of ruined iron on a piece of plank. As dusk fell, Pritchard came to inspect. He kicked at the neat rows of nails. "Useless," he pronounced. "Just like you. Get back to your cabin. You stink of smoke." Amos walked through the twilight, the smell of rain and burning clinging to him. His cabin was dark, empty. The silence was no longer a refuge, it was a tomb. He lay on his pallet, his hand finding the grooves of Hope's name underneath. He thought of his mother in the brick smokehouse. He thought of the fleeing shadow. He thought of the hinge in his hand, a piece of something that had once held a door fast. A plan, cold and sharp, began to form in his mind. It was not a plan of escape, he was too young, the world too vast and unknown. It was a plan of witness. If they could make things disappear, people, tools, hope, he would learn to make them reappear. Not with his hands, but with the secret language he carried. He would record. He would remember. He would, in the only way he could, mark the graves. The next morning, Leah was gone. There was no announcement, no farewell. One of the house servants, a woman named Sarah who had sometimes shared a ration of sugar with Hope, slipped Amos a piece of cornbread wrapped in a cloth. Her eyes were red-rimmed. "She gone, child. Before sunup." Trader's wagon headed south. Sarah pressed the bread into his hands. "She said to tell you, to be her good, quiet watcher." Amos took the bread. He did not cry. He felt a great, hollow space open up inside him, a cavern where the sounds of the loom and his mother's whispers used to echo. He was alone. Linus Davenport, perhaps sensing the dangerous fragility of a child with nothing left to lose, had a new assignment for him. He was to be a helper in the stable and the main house yard, under the direct supervision of Pritchard. It was a move of cold calculation, keep the orphan close, under the eye of the men he might fear the most. Amos's days were now filled with mucking stalls, polishing harness brass, sweeping the veranda, and fetching for anyone in the big house who demanded it. It was mind-numbing, endless labor. But it also placed him at the very heart of the plantation's operations. He saw the ledgers when the bookkeeper left them open on the porch table. He heard the conversations between Linus and his cotton factors. He learned the rhythms of the house, the comings and goings of visitors. And he saw everything. He saw the way Mrs. Davenport would avert her eyes from the whipping post in the far yard, pretending it was a maypole. He saw young Master James, now a sullen man of 20, drink himself into stupors and take liberties with the serving girls in the pantry. He saw the secret, furtive kindnesses, the cook slipping an extra biscuit to a sick child, the groom hiding a mare's lameness from Pritchard to save her from a beating. And he began his work. His medium was the only one available to him, the land itself. With a sharp flint, he would etch marks into the hidden undersides of things. On the bottom of the water trough in the stable, he carved a series of notches and initials for every person sold from Greenhill that year. Behind a loose brick in the kitchen chimney, he used a stick of charcoal to write the names of children born in the quarters. In the soft dirt of a rabbit warren under the old oak, he buried small bundles of cloth tied with string, one for each death, each knot representing a year of life. It was a ledger of bones and breath, written in a language only he could fully decipher. He added to it constantly. He recorded the date of a terrible storm that flooded the lower fields. He noted the arrival of a strange preacher who spoke of a jubilee and was promptly chased off the property. He even dared, one moonless night, to carve a single word on the inside of the bell post, where the call to work was rung each morning, remember. His secret skill became his sanity, his rebellion, his religion. He was no longer just Amos the quiet watcher. He was Amos the recorder, the keeper of the true account. The silent child had found his voice, and it was etched into the very fabric of Green Hill. The tension within him grew, a tightly wound spring. He knew the risk. Discovery meant certain, severe punishment, likely death. But the compulsion was stronger than the fear. He had to prove that they had existed. That Hope had laughed. That Leah had loved him. That Elijah had walked into the water. That they were more than numbers in Linus Davenport's ledger. One afternoon, his vigilance led him to a discovery that changed everything. Sent to fetch a dropped riding crop from under the front porch, he found a small, water-stained bundle tucked deep into a crevice in the foundation. It was wrapped in oilcloth. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded many times. With trembling hands, he unfolded it. It was a hand-drawn map. It showed Green Hill, the river, roads leading north. There were symbols, a star next to a certain creek bend, a cross near a particular stand of pines. At the top, in a careful, unfamiliar script, were the words, "For the travelers. Follow the drinking gourd." It was a freedom map. A conductor's guide. It was old, brittle. Someone, long ago, had hidden it here, a seed of hope left to germinate. Amos's heart hammered against his ribs. He stared at the lines and symbols. This was the language of escape, the opposite of his language of memory. One looked forward, the other looked back. But they were kin. Both were testaments against oblivion. He committed the map to memory, tracing every line with his eyes until it was burned into his mind. Then, with great care, he rewrapped it and placed it back in its hiding spot, a little further back. It was not his to take. It was his to know. That night, as he lay in his cabin, the map and his own hidden record swirling in his mind, he understood his turning point had arrived. He could not leave. Not yet. He was still a child, and the map was a path, not a promise. But he could prepare. And he could use his position, his watchfulness, for something more than remembrance. He could become a sentinel. He could watch for the travelers. He could, in his small, silent way, help the map do its work. Weeks turned into months. The heavy heat of summer gave way to the crispness of fall. The cotton was picked, ginned, and baled, and a tense exhaustion settled over Green Hill. Amos kept to his routines, his eyes and ears perpetually open. He noticed new things, a quilt airing on a cabin line in a particular pattern. A certain song hummed in the fields. He understood these were signals, part of a quiet network he was only beginning to perceive. One evening in late October, with a cold wind cutting through the pines, he saw a traveler. He was coming back from drawing the last water for the stable horses when he saw a man crouched in the shadows of the ice house. The man was not from Green Hill. His clothes were ragged, but he moved with a panther's grace. He was studying the back of the great house, his gaze fixed on the window of the library, where a single lamp burned. Amos froze. He should have turned, run, raised an alarm. That was his duty as property. But the memory of the map under the porch, of his mother's desperate eyes, held him fast. He set the water bucket down without a sound. The men sensed him. He turned slowly. In the gloom, Amos could see a face gaunt with hunger and weariness, but with eyes that held a fierce, unbroken light. The men raised a finger to his lips. For a long moment, they stared at each other, the ragged fugitive and the silent child. Then, Amos did something he could not have explained. He gave a single, sharp nod. He pointed to the woods behind the ice house, then made a series of quick, deliberate gestures with his hands. Wait. Danger. Dogs. He mimed drinking from a cup, then pointed to a spot near the slave quarters where a broken pump often left a puddle of clean water. The man's eyes widened in understanding. He nodded back, then melted into the deeper shadows. Amos's hands were shaking as he picked up the bucket. He had done it. He had made contact. He had chosen a side. For the next 2 days, Amos became the silent guardian of the traveler. He left a corn cake wrapped in leaves by the broken pump. He diverted a hunting dog by accidentally dropping a scrap of meat soaked in pepper far from the ice house. He watched Pritchard like a hawk, ready to create a distraction, a dropped bucket, a spooked chicken, if the overseer drifted too close to the hiding place. On the third night, a storm blew in, sheeting rain and howling wind. It was perfect cover. Amos, lying awake, knew the traveler would move. He slipped from his cabin, a piece of torn oilcloth over his shoulders. He went to the ice house. The man was there, ready to go. "You're the quiet one," the man whispered, his voice a rasp. "They say you see everything and say nothing." "Thank you." Amos reached into his shirt and pulled out a small, flat object. It was a piece of smooth cedar bark. On it, with a nail, he had scratched 2 things, a rough copy of the star symbol from the map by the creek bend, and a single word, north. The man took the bark, his fingers closing around it as if it were gold. "What's your name, son?" "Amos." "I'm Henry." The man looked at him, and in that look, Amos saw recognition of his own hidden fire. "You got the marking spirit in you. I can tell. You keep marking, Amos. You mark it all down. For the ones who come after." Then Henry did something unexpected. He reached out and placed a hand on Amos's head, a brief, solemn blessing. "Be safe, young recorder. Your time will come." And he was gone, swallowed by the rain and the roaring dark. Amos stood there, the rain plastering his hair to his scalp, a strange, warm feeling blooming in his chest. It was not happiness. It was purpose. He had been seen. He had been named. Young recorder. He turned to go back to his cabin, his spirit lighter than it had been in years. He did not see Pritchard step out from behind the smokehouse. The overseer's face was a mask of cold triumph in the flicker of lightning. He had seen the exchange. He had heard the name. "Well, well," Pritchard said, his voice slicing through the storm. "The quiet little watcher ain't so quiet after all. Harboring a thief of another man's property. Conspiring. I always knew you was trouble, since that shed burned." Amos's blood turned to ice. All his careful silence, his watchfulness, shattered in an instant. Pritchard grabbed him by the arm, his fingers biting deep. "Master Linus is gonna want to have a long talk with you, boy. And this time, there won't be no sifting ashes." Amos was not taken to the smokehouse. He was taken directly to Linus Davenport's study, a room he had only ever glimpsed through a doorway. It was lined with books, smelled of leather and beeswax. A fire crackled in the hearth. Linus sat behind a massive walnut desk, examining a ledger. He looked up as Pritchard shoved Amos into the center of the room. "He was aiding a runaway, master," Pritchard announced, his voice dripping with vindication. "Giving him food, warning, and a written direction. I saw it with my own eyes. He had a conspiracy with the men. Called him by name. Henry." Linus closed the ledger slowly. His gaze settled on Amos. It was not angry. It was curious, analytical, as if Amos were a flawed piece of machinery. "A written direction," Linus repeated softly. "You cannot write, boy." Amos said nothing. He stood, dripping on the fine Turkish rug, his mind racing. The carved names, the hidden records, if they searched him, if they pressed him, they would find the evidence. His life was over. "Search him," Linus said. Pritchard roughly patted Amos down, finding nothing but the nail he always carried. He then grabbed Amos's hands, turning them palms up. "Look at this, master." His fingers. Stained, calloused in a peculiar way. Not just field work. This is from gripping a tool for fine work. For scratching. Linus stood and walked around the desk. He took Amos's hand, examining it with the detached interest of a naturalist. He saw the charcoal stains ground into the skin, the unusual wear on the index finger and thumb. "Where?" Linus asked, his voice still terrifyingly calm. "Where have you been making your marks?" Amos remained silent, his eyes fixed on a point on the floor. Linus sighed, a sound of profound disappointment. "You have been treated with more leniency than most, Amos. After your mother's indiscretion, I kept you close. I gave you lighter duties. And this is how you repay that benevolence. With theft, with treachery, with this scribbling." He released Amos's hand. "Pritchard, take him to the smokehouse. We will find the truth of this. Every mark. Every secret." The smokehouse was colder than the night outside. It smelled of old salt and despair. Pritchard tied Amos's wrists to an iron ring set in the wall. He lit a single lantern. "You're gonna tell me where every one of your little carvings is," Pritchard said, picking up a short, flexible cane. "Or we're gonna be here until the sun comes up." The first blow landed across Amos's shoulders. It was a sharp, fiery pain that stole his breath. He clenched his jaw. "Where?" Pritchard demanded. Amos thought of Hope's name under the pallet. Of the notches on the trough. Of the word "remember" on the bell post. They were his testament. They were all he had left of his family, of his people. To reveal them would be the final betrayal. He shook his head. The blows fell in a steady, rhythmic rain. Amos lost count. He bit his lip until he tasted blood. He focused on the faces in his mind: Leah, Hope, Henry the Traveler with his fierce eyes. He focused on the feel of the cool cedar bark in his hand as he gave it away. He did not cry out. His silence infuriated Pritchard. The overseer stepped back, breathing heavily. "Stubborn little mule. Just like your mama. She didn't talk neither, not till the end." Amos's head snapped up. "What?" A cruel smile spread across Pritchard's face. "Oh, she talked. After a few days in here, she saw reason. Told us all about her silly plan. The fisherman. The boat. She begged. Said she'd do anything. But Master Linus, he don't tolerate poison in the well. She was sold the next morning." He leaned in, his breath sour. "But you know what? That fire in the tool shed. That was her final word. She didn't knock over no lamp. She set that fire herself. A last little act of defiance. Thought she could cause some trouble on her way out." He chuckled. "Didn't do her no good. Just made Master sure he was right to be rid of her." The revelation hit Amos with more force than any cane. His mother had not been passive. Her spirit had not been broken. She had fought back, with the only weapon she had left. That was the shadow he had seen, not Pritchard, but Leah, making her final, furious statement before being taken away. She had not given up. She had burned something of theirs. A strange, wild feeling surged through his pain, a mix of pride, grief, and a terrifying clarity. At that moment, the door of the smokehouse creaked open. Linus Davenport stood silhouetted in the frame. He looked at Amos's bleeding back, at Pritchard's raised cane. His expression was unreadable. "Enough, Pritchard." "But Master, he ain't talked." "I said enough." Linus stepped inside. He looked at Amos. "You possess a stubbornness that is both a flaw and, in another context, a strength. You have intelligence. You have observation. But you have directed these gifts toward subversion and ingratitude." Amos lifted his head, looking directly into Linus's eyes for the first time. He did not see a monster. He saw a man who genuinely believed he owned everything in his sight, the land, the crops, the people, and their stories. And in that moment, Amos knew he could never let him own his. "I have decided your fate," Linus said. "You are too intelligent for the field, and too rebellious for the house. You are a risk. I am selling you to a man I know in Mississippi. He runs a foundry. The work is hard, the discipline is absolute. It will cure you of these artistic notions." Mississippi. The word was a death sentence. The foundry was a rumor of hell on earth, brutal, short lives consumed by heat and iron. Pritchard untied him. Amos's legs buckled, but he forced himself to stand. Linus turned to leave. "Master," Amos said, his voice a raw, cracked thing. Linus paused. "The fire," Amos whispered. "My mother. She did that. Didn't she?" Linus regarded him for a long moment. A faint, almost imperceptible flicker of something, respect, crossed his features. "Yes." A pointless, destructive gesture. It only confirmed her unfit character. Amos nodded. He had his truth. It was a small, hard stone of comfort. "Take him to his cabin," Linus instructed Pritchard. "He leaves at dawn." Amos was shoved into his dark, empty cabin. He was to be allowed no farewells, no final night in the place of his birth. He was property, being transferred. He lay on his pallet, every movement agony. The dawn was a few hours away. Then, the trader's wagon, the long journey south, the foundry. He thought of Henry, hopefully miles north by now, following the drinking gourd. He thought of his mother, setting a fire as her last act of defiance. He thought of his hidden records, scattered across Green Hill like seeds. They would be found, eventually, and destroyed. His ledger would be erased. Despair threatened to swallow him whole. But then, his fingers found the grooves under the pallet. HOPE. You be her marker. He could not let it all be erased. He had one night. One final act of recording. Ignoring the pain, he pushed himself up. He had no tools but his nail. He needed to make a mark that could not be found, could not be destroyed. A final entry in the ledger of bones. He knew where. He slipped out of the cabin. The storm had passed, leaving a sky scraped clean and full of icy stars. The plantation was still, wrapped in the deep sleep before dawn. He moved like a ghost, using every ounce of his watchfulness to avoid the patrol. His destination was not the quarters, not the outbuildings. It was the place he had avoided for 2 years. The slave graveyard. It lay beyond the last cabin, at the edge of the woods where the pines grew thick. No fence marked it. It was just a patch of rough ground, dotted with faint mounds and the occasional sunken spot where a coffin had collapsed. No markers. Just earth. He found the place by the shape of the tree, a lightning-blasted pine, its trunk split in a distinctive, sorrowful V. He knelt by the small, barely perceptible mound. The grass here was different, thinner. This was where he and Leah had buried hope. He took out his nail. He could not carve stone. He could not plant a sign. But he could do one thing. He began to dig. Not a deep hole, but a narrow, vertical shaft, right at the head of the mound. He dug down 6 inches, through the root-tangled soil. His wounded back screamed in protest, but he kept going, his movements silent and dogged. When the hole was deep enough, he reached into his shirt. He had nothing to bury. No toy, no lock of hair. He had only himself, and his secret. He took the nail, and on the inner wall of the small, dark pit he had created, he began to carve. Not letters this time. Letters could be read, and destroyed. He carved symbols. A series of marks only he would understand. A circle for Leah. A small star for hope. A series of lines for the years. A wave for Elijah. A gourd for Henry. A flame for the tool shed. He carved the essence of his story, a silent poem in the language of loss and witness. It was his heart, etched into the earth. When he was finished, his fingers were bloody and numb. He carefully pushed the soil back into the hole, packing it down, smoothing the surface until it was indistinguishable from the rest of the ground. The record was safe. It was underground, at the head of an unmarked grave. It would decay, eventually, but it would outlast him. It was his final, desperate act of faith, that the earth itself would remember, even if no one else did. He heard a distant cock crow. Dawn was coming. He stood, looking down at the anonymous mound. "Goodbye, Hope," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Goodbye, Mama." He turned and walked back toward the cabin, toward the waiting wagon, toward Mississippi. He walked not as a defeated child, but as a chronicler who had just written his last, best line. He carried no physical record with him. But he carried the map in his mind, the feel of the cedar bark, the sound of Henry's voice, the heat of his mother's final fire. They were his North Star now. As the first gray light touched the horizon, the trader's wagon rumbled into the yard. Amos, with no possessions, was led to it and ordered to climb in the back with 2 other souls being sold away. He did not look back at Green Hill. He looked ahead, at the long road winding south. The wagon lurched into motion. Just as it passed the great house, Amos saw a flicker of movement at an upstairs window. A curtain twitched. For a single, fleeting second, he saw the pale, troubled face of Mrs. Davenport, watching him go. Their eyes met across the distance. Then the curtain fell back into place, and she was gone. The wagon rolled on, carrying Amos away from the only home he had ever known, into a future of smoke and iron. Behind him, under the lightning-split pine, his story slept in the dark, patient earth, waiting. September 1882, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. The old man's hands trembled as he held the developed glass plate negative up to the gaslight. The photographer's studio was quiet, the smell of chemicals lingering in the air. He had paid a premium for the new, instantaneous process, wanting a clear image despite his age. The portrait showed a man in his early 50s, dressed in a sober but well-made suit. His hair was grizzled, his face lined not with softness, but with a kind of weathered endurance. He sat very straight in the chair, his hands resting on his knees. But it was his eyes that held the viewer. They were deep-set, calm, and held a stillness that seemed to see far beyond the studio's painted backdrop of Grecian urns. He was known here as Mr. Amos Freeman, a respected clerk at a shipping brokerage, a deacon at the Bethel AME Church, a man of few words but reliable action. He lived in a tidy brick row house with his wife, Charlotte, a teacher, and their 2 grown children, who were studying law and medicine. No one in his Philadelphia life knew the full weight of the stillness in his eyes. He had come north in 1858, not via the swamps or the river, but by sea, stowed away in the hold of a cotton ship that docked in Savannah, a desperate gamble by a young man who had survived the Mississippi foundry. He had carried nothing but his life, his memory, and a single, unshakable skill. He watched, he listened, he recorded. During the war, he had guided Union scouts along the Carolina coast, his knowledge of land and silent movement invaluable. After, he had taught himself to read and write properly, the letters finally free from their secrecy. He had built a life, a good life, on the foundation of that silence. But he had never gone back. Never tried to find the unmarked grave under the lightning-split pine. Some truths, he felt, were too sacred to disturb. Some records were meant to stay buried. He carefully wrapped the glass plate and placed it in a leather case. At home, he stored it on a high shelf in his study. He showed the printed photograph to Charlotte, who smiled and said he looked very distinguished. He showed it to his children, who teased him for his serious expression. Years passed. The photograph sat in its case. Amos Freeman passed away peacefully in his sleep in 1899, full of years and a hard-won peace. His children, going through his effects, found the portrait. They thought it a fine likeness and had it framed. It hung in the parlor for a time. But Amos's daughter, the lawyer, began to notice something. Visitors to the house would sometimes comment on the portrait. "Your father has such knowing eyes," they would say, or, "He looks like he's seen a great deal." More than one person remarked, uncomfortably, that the expression was haunting. Eventually, when her own children were young and prone to nightmares, she took the portrait down. She wrapped it in brown paper and placed it in an attic trunk, thinking she would put it back up when the children were older. But life moved on. The trunk was forgotten. It was not rediscovered until 1932, when her grandchildren were cleaning out the attic after her death. They found the portrait, the paper brittle with age. They were a new generation, educated, proud of their heritage. They saw in their great-grandfather's face not a haunting, but a history. They reframed it and hung it in a place of honor. Yet, the story behind the stillness, the source of the profound quiet in the old man's eyes, remained a family mystery. He had rarely spoken of his youth. The words Green Hill, Leah, Hope, the Foundry were fragments in old letters, unexplained. The full narrative had died with him, a final, personal silence. The portrait hung on the wall, a testament to a life lived, to freedom earned, to a future built. But the deepest truth of Amos Freeman, the boy who became a recorder, who buried his heart in a Georgia field to keep it safe, that story remained where he had left it. Not lost, but resting. A quiet testament, written in the language of the earth, waiting, perhaps forever, for a reader who would never come. It is all there, in the eyes. If you look closely, past the dignity, past the suit, past the years, you can see the child in the ashes, the boy etching names in the dark, the young man watching a shadow flee into the woods. You can see the keeper of the ledger, the guardian of the unmarked grave. You can see the quiet, which was not an absence of sound, but the presence of a story too heavy to speak, and too important to ever be forgotten.